Hey there everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist and welcome back to my channel. Those of you here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also a writer working on my first 2 novels, one a standalone, one the start of a series. And on my channel I like to talk about what I consider to be the heart of writing, and that's the characters. The heart of the characters is their psychology. So that's the angle I like to take with pretty much everything I talk about on my channel. So today, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the writing process itself. My husband actually brought this up to me, and the way he phrased it was, how do you put your fiction in your fiction? And that is a whole series of videos in and of itself. So today I just want to focus on one element, and that is, how do you name things? So, naming things. I think this is the bane of every writer, especially if you're doing sci-fi or fantasy, because naming things is hard. For the most part, I tend to name things pretty easily, except secondary characters. The names for primary characters and main characters, they usually aren't any trouble for me. They come to me right away, or I have an idea, but secondary characters they just put me through hell. But I want to talk about this more on a broad level. So generally when you have sci-fi and fantasy, I think one of the problems people run into is you want to have the names of things that seem alien. They don't necessarily seem like they're part of our world, but they still make sense and they're still more or less pronounceable. I think that is an extreme that you can run into in fantasy, is when you're trying so hard to make something sound, for lack of a better word, exotic, that you create something that even the writer can't pronounce. And I think that's a problem, because while you can introduce names and places and things like that that are complex and interesting, you also don't want to make them so complex that your reader, when they come across them, is like, I have no idea how to even pronounce this name in my head, let alone out loud. And so I think that's a fine balance you have to kind of take. For myself, I tend to take, my approach is kind of Tolkien-ish, in that I look at what kind of language the culture uses, and I try to pull names from that. I'll just start with my main character's names. Ani. His name was pretty simple, because I was literally just going through letters and seeing how they looked together. And I've always had a thing for, I like names that end in I. I'm not sure why, but I've always liked those kinds of names. So when I put E-N-E-I together, I liked how it looked. And for some reason, just Ani, the pronunciation just came to me. So his was literally just random luck. Suna is based off of her home tongue, which is Gamal, and her name is actually based off of 2 things. It comes from the root word su, S-U, and the ending na, N-A. Su refers to something that is bright, beautiful, brings a sense of joy to people. Na is a term that is actually very ancient in their tongue. It's not used anymore, but you used to attach it to adjectives to make them more childlike. So her name literally means like childlike joy, sun, childlike beauty, that kind of thing. So hers, I literally pulled from her language. Timah. His is another one that comes from the language that I made up for his culture, which is Balana. And his name is one of those where he spells it T-I-M-A. And its root is actually T-I-M apostrophe A. And so there's actually a vocal pause there. So he pronounces it Timah. The official pronunciation is Timai. Timai. In his name, Balana is more complicated than the other languages. So the closest English equivalent I can give you guys for his name is essentially little one that will not be conquered by adversity. That's literally what the name Timah means. And as for why they changed the pronunciation, languages change over time. So his official pronunciation is based off of essentially their version of Balana that we would look at as like Old Latin. So similar, but not quite the same. Then you have Zava. I'll be honest, Zava's name came from a typo. It came from a typo. His original name was Java, and I am not a coffee drinker, so I totally did not get that connection. But when I was typing one day, I accidentally typed a Z instead of a J, and I liked it, so I stuck with it. So that was his. Then we have Akiska. His name is based off of his language, which is actually an offshoot of Balana, so it's similar in tone, but not quite the same. So you could, if you only knew Balana, you could probably figure out if you were stuck in his culture, but it would be very difficult. But long story short, his name means little gift that came from the ice, essentially. It's one of those names that have multiple meanings, actually, but that is the most common one that is used, so we'll go with that one. And then you have Nali. So Nali's, again, is one that I pulled from the language I made for the Stonemen. And they actually have about 2 to 3 languages that they routinely speak and that you will hear. So his is from their what would be considered their equivalent of like not Spanish, but like their second most common language. So his name means gem perfect when cut, and he was actually named by his father, not his mother, because he and his mother have a complex and difficult relationship. But that's where his name comes from. So that's the approach I take, but I recognize not everybody does that. So one thing I like to do with characters that may not get as much screen time as the others per se is I consider the culture influences that I have. So if I have a culture where I took some inspiration from Norse or Polynesian or, Japanese, Chinese, African, whatever, I'll go and I'll look in those languages and kind of get a feel for how those words sound, and then I'll shift them a little bit. And I think that works fairly well, and it gives you names that still kind of have a familiar flavor to them, but they're also different, and I think they're different enough that they fit in a fantasy world. When it comes to, for me, coming up with names for places, I tend to go with historically how places were named, and they were named honestly after landmarks, after things that were important to take note of. You may have a city that was by a water source, and so it might have had a name that literally translated to like city on water or something like that. And then over time, again, as language evolves and changes, the names of things change. I'll give you guys an example. One of the main cities of the Natusa in my world is Walstor, and that name translates in ancient Gamal to stone fort that did not fall. And that's literally what the city started as. It started as a simple fort on near a water source, and even though it was attacked multiple times from many different enemies, it never fell, and so that's where the name came from. I think sometimes, like, I'm going to talk about Tolkien here for a minute, because one thing I hear is that he came up with all these complex languages and stuff, and yet he named a mountain Mount Doom. Well, that is the translation of a Mount Doom. The name actually has two names. Oradrun is one, I believe that's in Sundarian, and the other one is Amon. I'm going to say this wrong. Amath, I think is how Aramath, I think is how you say it. And they each mean like fiery mountain or things like that, which again is kind of a landmark thing. So I think that works well. I think what people need to remember is that sometimes you kind of have to put your own language spin on it. So if something is named after, say, a pit in a field of flowers, yeah, you could technically call it flower pit, but that doesn't sound very good. So if you can come up with, okay, is there a specific type of flower? Is there a specific word they use for the patterns that are in the flowers? Things like that. Then you can create a more interesting name. Let's talk about surnames here for a second. So surname is like a family name or a last name. I'm from the United States, so the family name comes last. In a lot of Eastern communities, it would come first. Surnames have an interesting history because they're actually not that old. They're older in like China. Like I believe in China, they were used for thousands of years, and mothers would actually pass their surname on to their children. And then at some point in history, it shifted, so it then became the father's name. But in Western society, we didn't really start using surnames until about the late 900s, early 1000s. And it was usually for census purposes, honestly. Not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, that's kind of what it boiled down to, is necessity. So I see a lot of people in their fantasy stories that are struggling with, they can get the first name, is like, I need to figure out a appropriate last name. Who says your world necessarily has last names? Most of the cultures in mine do not. They do not have last names. You're identified in a lot of the cultures by either your middle name or by your relationship to your parents. So for example, among the Stonemen, someone's quote-unquote full name would be their name, and then son or daughter of, and then whatever their father's name is and whatever their mother's name is. Among the Natuba, they live very communally, so the only reason you really have a middle name is to kind of give you a little bit of an individuality, but you're all considered part of the same clan. So I mean, you know who your parents are, and most of the clan knows who your parents are, but it's considered not as important. The Natusa, you're identified by what den or clan you come from, and that is usually named after like the leader of the clan or whatnot. So if you were from, say, clan Sandspur, I'm just going to use that for an example, you would have your first name, and then you would say of clan Sandspur. And it's for that reason you actually don't hear a lot of family names repeated in the Natusa culture, for that reason. Because if you have multiple people with the same name from the same clan, it can get very confusing. So a lot of times, especially among the rural Natusa, you have to get your name cleared by the leader of the clan to make sure that it's not conflicting with anyone else. So that's a possibility too. And Who says you have to end with just a last name? Maybe you have multiple last names. I can't remember where I read it for the life of me, but there was one story I read once where a child took the last name of both their mother and their father, so it was always hyphenated. And I thought that was an interesting twist. So when it comes to surnames, one, you don't always have to have one, and two, you can be as creative with them as you want. A lot of the surnames that we have actually came from, again, descriptors. Smith, Baker, things like that. I'll give you guys a family example. On my father's side, his, I think it's his mother. I think it's the maternal line. Last name is Cavan. And when me and my husband went and traced that lineage back, the word Cavan literally means area of the wooden huts, and that's where our family line actually started. Was this place in France where there were villages made of wooden huts, and that's where the name Cavan came from. So I think a lot of times names start out with very simplistic origins, and I think that's something to remember when you're creating names for your world, whether it be for people or places, is think about the history behind it. Where necessarily does this name originate? What was its original reason for existing? Like, was it to direct people? Was it to give it to scripture? Was it to differentiate from something very similar looking? Things like that. Those are all things to keep in mind. And I think the other thing to consider too is accents and the way that people may talk. Like, for example, Zava is one of my characters who is actually a linguist, so he knows a lot of their ancient tongue, which is very rare. And their ancient tongue has a lot of what we call glottal stops, which is where your throat actually closes up when you're saying a word. So with the United States pronunciation, mit, that sound, that's a glottal stop. And their language has a lot of those. So because it's not his native tongue, though, it's very different from the tongue they speak now, because, like I said, language shifts, it changes. Because he's had to learn this, he is more, he understands to listen very carefully when other people are speaking. So he's going to catch things that other people don't necessarily catch just because of having learned this other language. The other thing is, remember, each language has its own slang, and that slang changes. I mean, you only need to look at the slang in the United States over like the past 50 years, and you'll see so many different terms. It means so many different things. And while I don't think you necessarily have to go in depth with that in your story, it's not necessary. I think it adds more flavor to your world, though, if you have slang. But it is something to consider, is just how much names and words change through history. And I think that's why knowing the history of your world, at least to a certain extent, is really important. For myself, I know the history of my world back multiple generations. I won't say how many, because that's a plot point, but it is something I keep in mind. Do I know, like, in excessive detail all the years? No. But I know a general overview. And so I think that's an approach people can take too. But again, this is just how I approach naming things in my world. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for you. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it this way. I just wanted to throw out a few of the ideas and kind of places that I draw from when I'm coming up with these kind of things. The other thing is to remember that if you have multiple cultures in your story, which most people do, they're not all going to call something the same thing. And that's actually probably one of my pet peeves with fantasy stories, is usually there's like this grand landmark and everybody calls it the same thing. But that's not necessarily true, especially if you have people that may have been a little isolated or that don't talk to each other very much, whatever. So I have landmarks in my world that have multiple different names depending on who you're asking. Like, for instance, there is a big mountain, a cliff right outside Balana Forest that they call it Eagle Eye, because the eagles would perch at the very top of it. But if you're gonna ask the Natusa what they call it, they would call it God's Peak, because in their ancient religions they used to believe that's where the gods were. So you kind of see what I'm saying. So those are kind of fun things to keep in mind too. So I'm interested to hear what techniques you guys use when you come up with places or names or things like that in your stories. Please leave them below. I want to hear all about them. As always, if you guys have any other comments or suggestions, make sure you leave them below. Feel free to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss when I upload. I try to upload every Sunday, every Wednesday. And until next time, I hope you guys stay safe and have a good one.